Today we welcome Donnie Maclurcan Ph.D. to Transforming Worlds. Donnie is a director at the PostGrowth Institute, an international organization that explores how we thrive within ecological limits. Donnie believes that purpose-driven enterprise is at the heart of a healthy market economy, and he has consulted over 500 not-for-profit projects and businesses across 32 countries, spending time based in Egypt, South Korea, Kenya, Fiji, the US, Argentina, and Australia. In this episode, we talk about transformation, post-growth, systems feeling, of course, also about Argentina, and the importance of being. Tune in. So I'm feeling very happy to welcome Donnie to our podcast and talk about transformation. Hi, Donnie. How are you?
Oh, Carola, all the better for being with you and your listeners today. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about post-growth, I presume, and we're going to talk about you as well. Tell us about what it is that you're doing and what is transforming in your life right now.
Well, I love this question because it gives me an opportunity to say something a little arresting from the outset, and that is what the Post-Growth Institute is doing more than anything else is learning how to be with each other. And this fundamental emphasis on being with each other that doesn't get the headlines in terms of if you look at our website, for example, which is going to be what our programs are, what our activities we're up to, is for us really, really foundational to any transformation exploration because it comes back to that essence of if we're interested in different kinds of futures that are aligned with what we feel is needed, then we have to start with how do we be with ourselves, with each other? How do we model the kind of futures that we might be talking about or seeking to bring through in our programs? And I'm excited to explore how that plays out in our organization, the ways in which we've learned how to be slower, more relational, more embodied, and also the ways that we circulate money and power in our organization in ways that seek to reflect the kinds of alternatives that our organization's mission is seeking to advance.
So tell us more about that mission because the Post Growth Institute has this Lemnis kit. What's that about? And what is it that
Yes,
you
yes.
do?
Well, actually, let's use this as an opportunity for your listeners to participate in an experiment that explains what we do and how we be with each other better than any verbal explanation. So, for this experiment, you'll need a piece of paper and a pen. So, if you're listening to this podcast and you need to just pause for a moment, go grab yourself paper and pen. And when you're ready, we're going to start by drawing a line down the center of your page vertically. Just draw a line down the center of your page. And then we're going to begin on the right-hand side by writing at the top of the right-hand side, write the word future. And on the left-hand side at the top, write the word present. So we'll start on the right-hand side. I want you to imagine a future that is working for everyone and everything, human and non-human species alike, an economy that's working for everyone and everything. Just imagine it for a moment. And when you've connected with some kind of imagery, drop down into your body and feel it. How does it feel in that economy that's working for everyone and everything? And when you've connected with the feeling, with your eyes open, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels in that economy. And now we move to the left-hand side. How does the present economy feel? And when you've connected again with that feeling, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how the present economy feels. Okay, so I've been conducting this experiment for maybe about 12 years now, all around the world, probably with more than 10,000 people to date, across, well, those people would easily have come from more than 100 different countries and across every kind of difference you can imagine, age, gender spectrum, background, spiritual beliefs, economic beliefs, etc. I've done this with Fortune 500 executives. I've done this with anarchists of all persuasions, people living on the street. It doesn't matter who I do this with, where I do it, or in what language. People consistently draw one of five symbols or shapes for the present and one of five symbols or shapes for the future, or a close variation or combination of these shapes. So for the future, people typically draw a circle, an infinity or panarchy symbol, like the Postgrowth Institute's logo, a spiral, a
Mm.
not a nodular blob, like if you splattered something up against a wall, or a heart.
Yes.
And for the present, what people typically draw is a jagged line, like a
Mm.
stock market index, a an isosceles triangle, a downward arrow, typically pointing down to the bottom right-hand corner, a rectangle, or sometimes a city skyline, or a mess of lines. So, Carola, what did you draw today?
I actually have two drawings for the present because I realized that once I drew the present, that it wouldn't be clear to anyone because I couldn't lift my pen. So
Right. Okay, so for the future, you had the heart, I see,
yes, and
and then
it's open-hearted,
and
so
the
it's holding hands, and I could keep the pen on the paper.
okay, okay. And for the
And the one
present,
on
there was the triangle straight away, and
right,
then
so
you
it
had
was a
the
danger triangle, which with an
and the
exclamation.
arrow. I think there's an is that an arrow in the middle? No, it's something else.
No,
So
it was meant to be an exclamation mark,
okay,
but I couldn't lift the
and
pen.
look at the jagged lines with the fire
Yeah,
underneath
the
as
other
well.
one's the
So
fire. Yeah.
you almost have all of the pieces because you have the nodular blob on the right hand side too with the hands.
Yeah.
So here's the takeaway. When we look at no matter what people draw for this, the consistency is that the future has non-linearity and the present has linearity. Just as we see in your picture there, right? You have non-linear versus linear. And that's fascinating because what is it about post-growth that we are seeking to bring forth? We're seeking to bring forth what we know in our bodies, that just as in all living systems, circulation is necessary in order to ensure life. So in nature, we have circulation of phosphorus, carbon, nitrogen, etc. And when we have accumulation of those things, we have death. Just like in our bodies with blood and oxygen as well. If we have an accumulation of that in a particular place, we have gangrene or heart attack or these sorts of things. And so this is a fundamental principle of all living systems. And what we all know, all of us know in our bodies, is that for a system to thrive and economy to thrive, it has to be aligned with those natural principles. It has to have non-linearity built into it. Just like you asked about our logo, that's because that's what we know works. But more importantly, it doesn't matter who you are in this world, no matter how much you're championing a particular brand of capitalism, for example, or growth, you know in your body that that's not a sustainable path. And what that means is people are just walking through this world with different levels of cognitive dissonance around that deeper knowing. At the Institute, what we seek to do is not bash people over the heads with ideas and say, you need to XYZ, but instead start with, you already know. And let's go from that point of knowing into what does that mean? What does it mean to move from the whatever you drew on the left-hand side to the right-hand side, for example?
And how does that knowing connect to the being you referred to?
Beautifully, because the fundamental aspect of recognizing that one's knowing is an embodied knowing rather than a disconnected, intellectual, rationalized approach that has been part of the patriarchal emphasizing in this world of like, especially through enlightenment, science of you can know all things, you can reduce things to certain aspects, etc. This deeper embodying of like there's actually things that we might even say are intuitive economics, right? Not learned economics. I call myself an intuitive economist. All of my economics work comes from embodied questioning and exploration. Does that feel right? Does that make sense? Systems feeling, so to speak. What that leads us, and I should say what that has led me to, and I think others as well, is the returning to the importance of how we be in our bodies with ourselves, as contrasted to the productivist, forced, capitalist driven, you have to define yourself and your worth is defined by what you do. So for us, there is an uncomfortability that's associated in this kind of patriarchal system with just being, that is our first gateway into relationality with ourselves and each other. If we're talking about alternative futures, we have to be able to be with ourselves. We have to, for example, be able to sit in silence when in our organization, when someone asks a question. The next thing that happens, if it's not a if it's not a rhetorical question, if it's actually a real question that people are seeking input on, the next thing we do is we will take 30 seconds, a minute of silence to reflect on how what is being asked lands in our body, what emerges for us from that space. And then we will ask if anyone would like more time. And in doing so, we open the spectrum of inclusion so that people with more introverted tendencies, who are so critical yet so silenced, often in somewhat violent ways in this kind of world, by someone like me with extroversion saying, who's improvisational, saying, anyone got any thoughts about this? And then someone like me jumping in and immediately taking over a conversation. When we slow down and sit with ourselves and recognize that, oh, what you're saying there, doesn't quite land. What's that about? What's that feeling of discomfort there? Oh, that's my own stuff. Or, oh, no, actually, there's something I want to say into the space. What happens then is that we create the space for collective wisdom to emerge. And it's only through a more embodied, affirming recognition of the intuitive wisdom that sits in all our bodies that we can really open up a future that is seeking to connect with, a recognition of Mother Earth at the center of all these things. Like you can't have you can't intellectualize your way to a post-capitalist, post-growth future, because it's going to miss all of the pieces that are important in our co-liberation, that actually returns us to what's real, what's relational, what's it like to be in relationship here living in Argentina with my family, and to recenter family because it's such a critical value here. What does that mean for me to show up at an Argentinian family gathering and realize that I've spent my life being programmed to say, what have you been up to? And then to discover that Argentinians, in my experience, don't ask that question. Instead, they just be with each other. They just drink mate and be. There's no like, how do I advance this conversation to find out the news? And so that's my long answer to this, like reconnecting with our being and working to that core piece that sits underneath the capitalist growth narrative of you are not enough. You don't have enough. You're never going to be enough. Well, being and working through to the discomfort of how that feels to just be is one of the strongest antidotes to respond to the narrative that you are not enough just for the very sake of being.
Yeah. It's beautiful how you intertwine the personal into your work, because for you personally, going against the narrative of you are not enough is very healing. I am Argentinian, it's no secret in this podcast. And I wonder what the difference is between cultures. Do people everywhere on earth experience this need that you talk about, that for us as Argentinians is very visceral? When we're in a group, we attune to one another, we attune to the group. So this is why there's no language for that. But it's particularly for Argentina, it's based on our constitution. We are sons and daughters of Pachamama. you once you're born on Argentinian territory, you are Argentinian. It's an inalienable right, which is very foreign to the country I live in, which is the Netherlands, which has an active citizenship. So if you pay taxes, you're Dutch. You know, I'm being a bit extreme. There's more nuance to it than that, but essentially it's based on participation. It's not
Mhm.
based on not doing anything. So I just wonder, how do different cultures, respond to this that you're saying? Let's take a moment to be, because for some people that feels very deep and scary.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it does. Because it flies in the face of a patriarchal system, uh, where the notion of being is going to be described as unproductive, unhelpful, not responsible, all of those sorts of things,
Yes,
right?
indeed.
Not contributing. And I think it's a very important narrative to decolonize, and I know that that language is contested in particular ways, but I would say definitely it's a decolonizing because it has been a colonizing force. It's been a tool of colonization. And I even think random, I'm going to go a little sideways here to my time in Kenya in Iten with the marathon runners. I was there as a journalist years back, and I went with an interest, a personal interest, to study what were the secrets of the Kenyan distance runners. And so I was speaking with Chipchoge Solway, who was my guide there, and Brother Colm, who was this athletic director who had trained more gold medalists, I think, than anyone in the world in terms of Olympic gold medals. And I noticed immediately upon arrival in Iten, I was on a bicycle, there were just hundreds of distance runners across genders sitting in the street, just talking with each other, right? Like just lining the streets, these world's top runners. And that was interesting. And when I got to talk to Brother Colm, I said, what do you think really is the secret of the Kenyan distance runners? He said, well, if you're really ready to hear it, I'll tell you. But it's not what anyone's written about ever before. I said, well, what's that? He said, the US runners, take the US runners who come here to train, right? They all think it's about the altitude, or they'll claim that if you were born at altitude and you've run all your life, that this is going to set you aside. That's not it. It plays a factor, but it's not really it. He said what happens is that the US runners will come here and do four things. The Kenyan runners will be here and will also do four things, but those four things will be different. The US runners will train, eat, sleep, and then they'll walk around and do things, sight, see, etc. They'll go places. The Kenyan runners will train, eat, sleep, and do nothing. And they do nothing at the moment, primarily where their digestive system requires them to do nothing. So they'll be sitting, by doing nothing, I mean they might just be sitting in silence, or they'll be sitting talking to someone very gently. They won't be moving their bodies. Whereas the US athletes might be sleeping at that time or moving. And we know that when you go to sleep, your digestive system shuts off. And when you're moving, same thing, you don't have the ability to fully digest. This aspect of just being is functionally understood in certain cultures better than others. And it makes sense to me that that notion of being, to extend that more broadly, because this is a strange example to provide, but more broadly, I mean, if you look at the weird study on behavioral economics that overturned the previous understandings of like what drived motivations in terms of individual economic choices and all sorts of existing economic theories. Well, what they discovered, as many of your listeners may know, this is the WEIRD studies, is that the cohorts by which these so-called theories about economic choice around the world, the samples were drawn from white industrialized populations in democratic countries that fit certain kind of mold. And those countries were largely individualistically leaning. When those tests were then redone around the world, they saw there was a mix and that your cultural context affected your economic behavior. In other words, there are cultures, and we know this, of course, that are more collective in their orientation, more
Mhm.
able to just be and support and don't center themselves, and others that are more individualistic. And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things for me is that whenever I talk about post-growth macroeconomics and I outline what a model of a post-capitalist market economy looks like, etc., the people that find it easiest, having done the drawing experiment perhaps, and then going into like what that model looks like, the people who find it easiest and get it and then start creatively riffing off it are Black women in the global South.
Hmm.
The people who find it hardest are white men in the global north, right? And that makes sense for a lot of reasons, but it's this disconnected, disembodied, individualistic, well, everyone's going to act the same way I act in the world because that's what I've been taught is that I am an example of the center of the universe. No, not true. Not the reality. And to your point, here me coming from Australia via the US to Argentina, here I discover this experience at mate time where I just have to learn to be with my limited Spanish. I have to learn what it's like to just let the conversation organically flow rather than seeking to drive it, which is really fascinating as an improviser, where I've always learned about coloring scenes, advancing scenes. Here, I just need to let the scene organically emerge.
Yeah.
And it does. It
Yes.
does.
It always does. Yeah.
Always
Yeah.
does.
Yes. Beautiful. I liked in the beginning you talked about systems feeling. And this is exactly that. When we feel into the systems, we become part of that sensory capacity that is so beyond us, isn't it? I was recently asked to speak at a conference in Milan, and my talk was about combining the works of Nora Bateson, Carl Jung, and Bruce Mao. So Nora Bateson is, of course, leading the Warm Data Labs and following the work of the International Bateson Institute. Carl Jung is comes from the psychoanalysis sector, and Bruce Mao is a Canadian designer. And what I liked about the perspective that Jung brings in is that he has this relatively famous quote where he says, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our life and we will call it fate. I think the same thing applies to the patriarchal system. Until we make it explicit, we will continue to act in accordance to its norms, which we've considered normality, and then realize that that was actually not really quite normal, and that most of us don't fit that mold that is so imposed on us. And I think that's to your point, that what has been molded by the narrative, by media, by what's supposed to be proper is not who people really are. Most of us are on many levels very different from that picture, and there is a huge connection in the recognition that it's okay to be different. I think that really is the time we are in right now, and why transformation is so critical, because it's changing the form, as the word says, across and then changing the form. Now, you and I are both strategists, at least on paper. I don't know what we do the rest of the day. How do you look at this changing narrative and the duality that is being exposed, really, leading to this huge polarization and this sense that that which we hope, that which you made us draw out of ourselves, that we drew it from ourselves onto paper, sometimes we feel disappointed. We feel like it's never going to happen, like it's too far out, that our dreams are just soap bubbles that are bursting all of the time. How do we deal with that?
Mhm. It's a great question, and it's one that I ponder regularly. And I ponder it from a space of privilege, having felt over the last few years very comfortable with my own journey with this question. And I'm going to use a little of that privilege as well to say something a little shocking, um, because I think I I think I grew up with this aspect of white saviorism that was able to overlay on my own trauma of not feeling seen in my life, such that then that played out, that I participated in that saviorism to certain extents in certain moments, and going through a journey of bringing the unconscious to the conscious so that it could then be addressed, and spending 30 years in therapy, and most of it in post-Jungian models, has been really helpful, because where I've come to is not so much some kind of detached, um, you know, path towards some kind of enlightened future, etc., but instead back to a deeply embodied space where my body tells me, and this is the shocking thing, we're not going to avoid full systems collapse. And what's interesting is that when I share that perspective with folks, and I use an asset-based approach in doing so. So I'll start whatever my sharing is with a strength, so that people feel safe enough in their bodies because biologically we're in the creative neocortex. And then I'll talk about the fact that what I see is ongoing cascading systems collapse, that we've been in collapse for. I mean, I look around here in Argentina, 54% poverty. I live in a neighborhood where many people, if not most people, are just struggling to survive. I think of the amount of the tens of thousands of people every day who die from hunger. Like, if that's not collapse, then what is collapse? I think about all the species lost over the last decades, and that's collapse. But I think it's easy to give a definition of full systems collapse that, says we're not there yet, in order to like hold on to some kind of hope.
Mm.
But then the flip side of that is that whenever I share this idea that we can't avoid collapse, I notice something fascinating in the audiences. I'll give a particular example. I was in Hungary a few years back, and I had 30 students in the audience that were maybe between the ages of 20 and 30. And the moderator, there was two of us on a panel, the moderator asked, like, how do we get out of this dilemma? The first person presented a very techno-utopian, we can innovate our way out of this.
Yeah.
And I got up and I said, I really appreciate this question. And it's such an important, like, this is an important question to me. So again, that reassurance, emotionally, psychological. And then I said, and I don't think we can avoid this collapse. And I noticed then something amazing. Everybody in the room, almost everybody's shoulders dropped.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I put that down to, having run that kind of experiment again and again, is that when you speak truth to what people know in their bodies, that resonance is on some level so deeply reassuring, to not have to hold up the facade, that having then created the spaciousness for accepting that, ironically, then we open up the spaciousness to get creative, to work out what is possible. What seeds are we planting for those generations that we so often tokenistically refer to in terms of indigenous wisdom of 7 generations ahead? What does it actually mean to plant a seed that you may never see in your lifetime? I don't for a moment imagine that the post-capitalist market alternative, along with the emboldened informal economy and demonetized, dematerialized economy that I'm seeking to help birth into this world with colleagues from all around the globe, I don't for a moment imagine that that's going to be the dominant model, or the central model in my lifetime. But I'm not in any way, I'm motivated more than ever to do this work, not in order to avoid collapse, definitely to ameliorate some of its impacts, but not to deny my own wisdom, which is we've gone too far. The systems are in play, the feedback loops are in play. Magic's possible, but not magic that is disembodied. And we're not turning capitalism around in the next few years, probably not next few decades. We're going to have to go through. Here's my prediction. We're going to see, with autocratic leadership and the polarity that you described, we're going to see an ongoing polarity. And as a result of that, what will most likely happen, in my opinion, is that people will, especially people in power, will point to the wrong things as the cause of what's actually going on,
Right.
right? That's
Of
history
course.
shows us that. So it's going to take some time for people to come collectively to an understanding. Who knows, decades, century, for those who are still here, to realize that patriarchal neocolonial capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with what you drew on the right-hand side of that diagram.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that the that which we feel is much more has more integrity than that which we are experiencing in a rationally organized world, because quite frankly, it's all constructs and it has nothing to do with real life. And it's always surprising to me when I talk about transformation and I talk about the metamorphosis that that implies, that it's actually a different form. And then I tell people, and I use obviously the caterpillar to butterfly metaphor to say what you don't want is hairy winged caterpillars trying to make as if they were butterflies, because that's what ends up happening, is that there's a lot of imposters trying to show you that future which we know in our vulnerability that we're wishing for, and it's very difficult not to lose hope within that context. Quite a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a group of youngsters in Sweden. We were asked to come with 12 people around the table, and I said, I'll be the gray-haired elder. And so we're talking to these kids, and there's a 14-year-old, and I say, why are you here? And he said, I was forced to. I said, oh, that's a wonderful position to be in. And he's like taken aback. And I said, I was born in a military dictatorship. And the beauty of that, because it's horrible, I mean, let's face it, but the beauty of it is that you see the absurdity. Like, you can't not see it. Everything is caricaturesque. There's these kind of forms of power that are so obviously made
Right,
up that you
right.
have the possibility to observe by the mere fact that you are there, and there's that feeling, what is really happening, what is really going on, and what might we do about that. But it's hard to be in the middle of it and
And you ha
realize that every little step counts. Every little bit is taking us in that direction, precisely for what you said. It's not linear. So who knows? Even when we're trying to imagine the future, we're putting linearity into it, because we also grew up in these systems and were educated in these systems.
and what you shared there about the absurdity that's so present, right? The emperor has no clothes in so many
Right.
circumstances. But because there's such a deep collective gaslighting, what's critical in order for us all to maintain our center is that we affirm, validate, witness each other in these moments. When
Yeah.
we hear someone speaking that truth that resonates from the embodied space, to say, I hear you and I resonate with that. Because there is also the danger, right, that under the pressures that come with the widening inequalities that are always associated with autocracy and oligarchy, that you will have the incapacity, especially as we see lockdowns and shutdowns of certain spaces for critical thought and exploration. The danger becomes, even with a virtual world that didn't exist 30 years back, there still becomes the danger of there not being enough spaciousness for us to feel, affirm, validate, and witness. And without the spaciousness, without the capacity to slow down, it doesn't matter how much we have good intentions in this space. If we're forced to just be moving at a million miles per hour, the only outcome that I see happening in those circumstances is just breakdown. People just like go, I'm out, and then they go into a catatonic state of sorts, right? Like it gets to that level of insanity. Whereas what I feel all activists, all people who are called to be part of the chrysalis that you're describing in my opinion, also called into is how are we seeking to weave in a regularity of slowing down, of having those spaces for communal validation, for communities of practice, for neighbors, etc., to validate the being, to keep grounded in the absurdity, to name the absurdity when it needs to be shared, etc. And for that not to become corporatized, like
Yeah.
I've got my 5 minute, meditation that I'm going to do now. Let's all do our 5 minute meditation together at the same time a day. No, 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 thank you. No, right?
Yeah.
To resist that the encroachment that will come into the spaces, the cracks that we're trying to keep open, to resist that again from a grounded space. And this to me is where real leadership is on display. When you see women in particular around the world who have fought so hard, particularly women of color, particularly frontline activists who have been holding that flame alight, keeping the spaciousness for validation in spite of, against the violence, the oppression of patriarchal, in all of the pieces, fill in the blank, right?
Mm-hmm.
Patriarchal, dot, 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 the holding of that spaciousness to remain connected to what's true, what one knows and feels in the body, not some kind of media junket, or news that you're getting that's trying to feed stuff into you, but what you just know in your body about what works, which is connection, connection to the land, connection to oneself, connection with each other, starting with the human, the non-human, and the relationality, and then building out from there rather than the typical approaches that get us very quickly caught up in policies for this and
Oh,
proposals around this and
yeah,
all of this intellectualization, this abstraction from what an economy really is all about.
yeah, yeah. Well, speaking about meditation, my mantra, which I actually learned from someone who's based in Spain, is "I don't know," because it really allows me to go away from the mind. So
Yeah.
we have this idea that knowing is only knowing logically, argumentatively, using language. And so whenever the shit hits the fan, which is quite often, I'm like, okay, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then that does allow me to feel into my body and to experience my body as a dashboard.
Ah,
To use a nicely
yes.
technological metaphor, and think, okay, so somewhere here there's a light bleeping or something telling me what I do need to know, which I cannot know by thinking, and really going to that level. But it's really hard to do. And still, for me, it's this absolute conviction that when we talk about policy making, we talk about activism, these are still based on masculine energy. And actually, the feminine energy of, humus, the earth, compost, darkness, not knowing, is actually
Mm,
much more of what we need to
no,
bring into these spaces, because it's the nurturing energy that allows us not to know. And then, super important for my own mental health, not get anxious about not knowing,
right,
because then I go into doing, which is like you keep repeating the pattern. And then, really, the reassurance that continuing to express that does not require to take the form of a dialogue. So, being kind, being present, being a role model. I mean, I'm in my 50s, so I finally got to that point, uh, is enough. Maybe the other person
mm,
is having a dialogue with me after they left my actual physical presence. They're
right.
thinking, hey, how's Carola doing that? Well, if she can do it, maybe I can too. Or it was nice to be in that space. Can I create it for myself? And
Mm,
this sense is super important that we keep bringing in, but it is coming for sure from a place of privilege, because we still need to feed ourselves. We need to pay our
right.
mortgages. We need to take care of our families. And that is
Yeah.
still a tension that is very, very present, and that really we will have to address with tiny, tiny steps. If we go at that tension with the equal amount of force, it's just going to collapse even more quickly, I think.
Yeah. No, it's music to my ears what you're saying, because and I'll come back to this piece around the tension there. But first of all, I work as a counselor outside of my work with the PostGrowth Institute, and I often talk to clients who are saying, I don't know, and I get them to a space where they realize that that is a wonderful, wonderful thing, as you said, because it's signaling the gateway to the feminine. boom, you are now entering the territory of the unknown.
Yeah.
What a marvelous space to be in versus, as you said, the conditioning that if you don't know, you're an idiot. You don't know, you're not useful. If you don't know, then what have you got to contribute? You've got nothing to say, do, etc. And so in the Post-Growth Institute, we seek to, using sociocracy, a form of consent-based decision making, we build on asset-based approaches. This is our own internal approach to these things. We start with strengths that gives us a little more of the emotional, psychological safety to drop into the body. Then having done that, along with grounding processes in our meetings and check-ins that allow people to be fully present, say exactly how they're feeling in any given moment, show up just as they are, be held in that kind of container of safety that it's okay, whatever's happening, whatever time you arrived at the meeting, etc. In that space, we then open up for that reflection, for people's inner wisdom to emerge, and then a proposal might get made, objections might get made to that, etc. And what we collectively discover again and again is that notion that the sum of the parts being greater than a whole. To witness that happening feels amazing. Amazing. I've heard people say this again and again
Mm.
because it restores hope on the deepest level, because the Cartesian training of, if you've got this bit of knowledge and this person's got this knowledge, you can get those two together and it equals, the sum of those two. No, no. When you get a group of people together who go, well, I'm proposing we do this program, and someone says, I object, I think we're missing this bit, and they add something in, they change the proposal, someone else does it, and you come out with a masterpiece of a proposal, and then you go test, was it actually wisdom?
Mm.
That reminds you that if we create spaces, even in these pressured areas, as you said, where there's the privilege for certain people to have spaciousness, when you create those possibilities, or even, as I think about this, cultures that under pressure choose to elect to maintain those spaces. For example, I was driving through a very poor Vija here about a year ago with the family, and I noticed it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were just people out in the streets, sitting in the chairs, drinking mate, right? It was mate time. And I said, how is that possible? I know in my body that these families have hunger. They are struggling to put money on the table, that those parents are going to go, no doubt, and immediately go to work after their time here. And my father-in-law he said, that's something that's non-negotiable here, right? Like, up to an extent that's actually feasibly possible, that people will do the trade-off, right? They will make the time to be with each other even as the shit is hitting the fan. And
Especially as the
especially as the shit is hitting the fan, right? And that's, I mean, all of this, what I think is a lot of lip service of folks like myself in the global north saying, all this wisdom in the global south, or indigenous wisdom. Where's the actual wisdom that we should be looking to? It's in the stuff that's right in front of us, that's right there, hidden in plain sight, right? You can turn to all sorts of thinkers and leaders, and all of that's important, don't get me wrong. But when you actually look at the stuff that's hardest to actually accept, like the Kenyan runners not doing anything, and the wisdom in that, instead of some kind of like, oh, what's the deeper, it's right there. It's in the way that people be with each other. There's the wisdom right there. The way they stay with their hands rooted in the soil, like that's it. That's it.
That's fascinating, and you're making me think of a lot of things that are related to my discipline as a designer. So, what you've just shared is what we call the crit, the design critique. So, a designer is never offended by feedback to his or her work because we're not our work. So we make stuff, and then when we go and have the crit, we look at our own stuff as well. So we're not just displaying the stuff, we're actually becoming participative with the group to critique our own designs. So it's actually something you can learn to do. And I hope that people will be learning and sharing this as a practice more and more. And the other thing you made me think about is I was working in the advertising industry, which is known for being very creative, and I started bringing sort of quirky people into my team, including, for example, architects or people who had, backgrounds in creating all kinds of artsy stuff. And they came in and they said, Corona, but these people are not very creative. And then I understood there is a difference between being creative.
Mm.
Creative is regenerative in your language. It's looking at things with wonder and appreciation of what might be. That's creative. And creators are makers. And what we create, what do we do with that afterwards? We consume it. And it looks like the left hand side, it goes up in flames, just like fire, it gets consumed. So when you create, you are just creating for the heck, for the loveliness, let's put it that way,
Mm.
for the loveliness of making. And when you are being creative, you are being inclusive, and you are looking for what wants to emerge. And this
Mm.
difference is super important in both in my work as in yours. The more we can bring this to people and say,
Oh,
sometimes just being is a creative act.
oh gosh, so resonating with this. I'm even thinking of a colleague who was in our team a few years back who said that they enjoyed just spending time every day staring at the ceiling.
Yes.
And that for me was a fascinating thing to consider because it reminded me years back. When I was young, I wrote music sort of when I was 7, 8, 9 years of age, and then I stopped for 25 years.
Wow.
And I was speaking to a friend about this because it was a passion of mine, and they said, "Well, why don't you just write the music not for any kind of output, just for the sake of writing it?" And I'd written a couple of songs, that were for people for various events, etc., which I was like, oh, I get the gratification of they receiving it, etc. And it was hard. And then this person said this, and I shifted, and it became so easy. It
Beautiful.
was so
That's
joy-filled. It was,
in the shamanic medicine wheel, which comes, of course, from the Andes, the numerology for creativity is the number 4. And the number 4 is also the numerology for rest.
Mm.
And so you cannot have, because it's also the sort of light and dark in a Jungian kind of way,
Yeah,
you cannot have creativity if there is no peace. You cannot have creativity if there is no rest. Nothing can grow out of soil that is barren. So you have to feed your livelihood through rest. And
yeah,
then that livelihood will want to dance and create and make music and draw and connect. But you cannot
yeah.
sort of literally, you can't pour from an empty cup. So you cannot pour creativity out of not having taken care of what's really primarily important.
Oh, 100%. And I'm going to go out on an edge here because there's a learning that I am still grappling with over the last few years it just came through my body in a way that arrested me. I realized that not only myself, but almost everywhere that I was looking was largely looking at rest through a productivist lens
Mm.
or subservient to the masculine, to the doing. In other words, the sentence like, how was your weekend? Was it rejuvenating? The framing of that is often then in service, rejuvenate for what purpose? To be able to work, rather than the notion of rest for rest's sake. Like you said, where then the creatives, look, given we're going there in this conversation in ways I hadn't anticipated, I think it's fine to say. I mean, I'm sure we're on the same page here. If you don't give the spaciousness for the feminine to breathe, then the feminine won't breathe. It won't have that capacity for that creative spark, genius, etc., to emerge if it's constrained. it's going to instead ooze into a shadow, aspect of that wants to highlight that it's
It
constrained.
looks like
Exactly,
that.
right? Exactly. And so if we think about organizations, transformation, new economics, etc., where are we creating spaciousness so that the tendency to constrain, to subjugate the feminine within and the feminine without, in terms of the experiences that we're having, is held at bay to a sort because of the design. I'm convinced
Of
that the
course.
design of experiences and the way that design shows up in process, etc., is so fundamental to the transformation you and I are describing here.
No, but the
Without,
design, just as in everything else, garbage in, garbage out, right? So design is a craft. Design is an ability. Now, it necessitates intention. If the intention is shit, what's going to come out of the design is shit. It's just that there's no way
right.
around it. So the good news is I mentioned my three gurus for the talk,
Mhm.
Nora, um, Carl Jung, and Bruce Mao. And Bruce Mao says, look, the bad news is everything's designed. The good news is it was us who designed it, so we can change it. Boom. We can change it. We can. One little bit at a time, one intention at a time, one breath at a time, and eventually things do shift. I mean, hopefully that is what you're doing at the Post Growth Institute to shift the worldview, right? And
Yes,
shift is gradual. It's not,
right.
that doesn't
And
happen.
this
Yeah.
this this does raise an interesting point because people often ask us about, what can I do, right? And
Yes.
outside of that, exploring how we be with each other and the transformative power of that, the things that I would suggest people do are things where there is the potential for systems change associated with individual actions. And I'll share a few of those in just a moment. But before I do that, there has been a somewhat understandable but problematic, in terms of what I'm going to describe, narrative from the left or progressives
Hmm.
that individual actions are part of the plot from neoliberal capitalism to put everything back,
Yeah.
onto you,
Hmm.
the individual, and that we need to be focused on the system. But also, I understand that, but it's also a very disempowering narrative because people are looking, where's my agency? What can I do in this kind of system? And here's some examples of things you can do that affect systems change. You can look to move your money if you have any. Where is your money in the system? With which kind of bank? Can you move your money over to a not-for-profit bank from a for-profit bank? That has a fundamentally massive impact and implications. If you have any investments or debts, moving of those as well over to models that fit the right-hand side of what you drew in terms of circulation of profits without private individual ownership underneath the ownership structures. Moving your consumption. We're all consumers, whether we like that term or not. We all make purchasing decisions at some point in our life. Where those decisions are, do you have the privilege to explore your agency there, to take the time sometimes to make those decisions, do your homework? Where's your labor if you're working in the formal economy? Moving your attention in terms of advocacy. And for me, these all become things of, where can you find alignment with models that are non-linear? And the exciting news is that almost 20% of the global GDP comes from forms of business that are without private individual equity ownership, consumer cooperatives, foundation-owned businesses, non-profits with business models underneath them, and government enterprises. So, for example, moving over to Proton, which is an email provider that has just recently become not-for-profit, is a powerful way to shift. Moving your browser from Google Chrome, for example, over to Mozilla Firefox moves from a for-profit over to a not-for-profit entity. These things have subtle but important impacts because they address the systemic inequities that happen with money and debt in our system, and that's what underpins the separation that you and I are describing in
Hmm.
terms of this disembodied approach is this linearity comes from a system that has baked into it the growth of money and money supply and debt stocks. And that and the separation between those, and what I mean to not be too abstract there is inequality is baked into any form of capitalism, period. There is no just and sustainable form of capitalism at all. Mathematically, it's not even possible. So to move beyond that, to come to what is it that I'm called to do, in addition to slowing down and actually like recognizing that often we do have agency, to think about intervention points in terms of where your money, if you're associated with money in any particular way, where's that flowing to and from? Where's your labor, your energy, these sorts of things? Those can become very powerful things, especially if you think of the story of Kristen Christian, who in Los Angeles many years back, 2011, got tired of her for-profit bank gouging her. So she put up a post saying, I'm not banking with Wells Fargo anymore. I'm moving over to the credit unions. Put that up on Facebook. And $4 billion followed her.
Wow.
Almost 500,000 people moved their money in what became known as the Move Your Money campaign just from a Facebook post. That's real power. That's transformative change in a system where 1% of financial equity in the whole country of the United States of America shifts over from a for-profit extractive system to a not-for-profit circular model.
Wow, those are great examples and great ideas. We're going to add those also to the show notes to remind people these are the things that you can do. It's important that we remind one another of
Yeah.
that. So, in a world in which these things start happening and we get to fast forward maybe 20 or even 50 years in time, what might the world look like then?
Well, it's a good question. And I would come back to what it might feel like as much as anything else, right? What might it feel like? I sense that, and again, if this is beyond my lifetime, perhaps, I sense that there will be a slowerness about things, whether that's by forced, by the disruption of some of the kinds of things that perhaps many of us have become reliant on with respect to click and deliver or, you know, go somewhere and expect certain things to happen in a certain way. But I mean, that notion of the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? I think of that in terms of post-growth futures being here and just not evenly distributed because here, for example, in Argentina, I spend readily, regularly up to an hour in the supermarket line waiting to be right. Like
Yeah.
it's a it's a it's a normalized aspect of life here. Now, if that happened where I used to live in the US, there'd be outrage. Like it would probably make national headlines, right? In other words, the future that you're asking about, to me, that kind of patience and, oh, so I'm going to use this time to just be. Often I'll just stand there, or I'll talk to my wife if we're there together, or family, or we'll make a call or something like that if needs be. That adaptation that so much of the world, as we mentioned before, about like crises and crashes and collapse already existing, having existed in so many colonial, neo-colonial spaces throughout the world. I imagine the future will draw on much of the lived resilient experience of people who have been living through collapse ahead of the curve in many ways.
Hmm.
And of course, certain things will, continue to innovate and change, and there's things that we can't predict that'll emerge. But at the end of the day, my hope is that it's a future where there is that ongoing exploration that's going to take centuries, I imagine, of a reconnecting with the feminine within, with an understanding of how the patriarchy and its separation from the feminine has actually wounded us all in so deep ways that take time with the layers of the onion to recognize the conditioning that has been baked in. All of that, I hope in 50 years, there'll be the spaciousness around the world with a slightly slower, if not dramatically slower pace, for that to be unfolding in our collective co-liberation.
And 10 years ago, I wrote a book which was titled Change Ahead. And meant as you're a native speaker, so you immediately get the pun, but it's change ahead of the change and change coming at you. Yeah, so it's intended in both directions.
Mm,
And in that book, I talk about the quest for questions because looking for answers, especially in liminal times and uncertain times, makes no sense at all. Like you don't have them by the sheer fact that we're in a moment of unfolding. So, what question might we have then?
well, I'm going to do something unusual and ask you, what question do you think we might have then? And then I'll share my thoughts.
All right, so I think that the question that we might have is a rather obvious one, and that's why didn't we do it before? I also
Mm,
have another question, which would be why the heck didn't we have a name for it? Why did we keep naming it by what it's not? It's not growth. Oh, it's not the elephant in the room. Yeah, but what is it then? And I think that the question that we will have is, what is your name? To feel into the name of that way of being.
mm,
As we embrace our human beingness instead of our human doingness. But the big question is, why didn't we do this before?
mm. Yeah, that would be an interesting time if there was that question present. I've always wondered if that is how things play out in the sense of retrospective, because that notion of like, I don't want my kids to that phrase I often hear, I don't want my kids to ask what were what did you do, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah. The
And yet
hieroglyphic
I
staircase.
right, and yet I've not heard many kids ask their parents that
No,
question. And
no.
so I wonder whether or not, I mean, I'm looking back at these times, right, where history, I've heard the sentence recently that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so, because I look back at, the rise of fascism and autocracy around the world right now, and I go like, but surely there's enough people recognizing the signs from the past, and the realities are that there's not enough people recognizing those signs, and there's lots of ways that those things get twisted, etc. So I wonder whether or not we get to that space where we look back and we say like, why didn't we name it faster, etc. For me, the question, and it could be, and I hope we have that space. For me, the question I feel will probably still be oriented forwards, because I think that 50 years from now, there's going to be lots of challenges. And I sense it will be, how do we how do we navigate um, these 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 changing moments? I think it will be more about that like for me, it would be about that adaptivity, about how does one yeah, how does one navigate in a more sensory space if, for example, the ongoing overload of information continues? There's got to be a moment for me where it all becomes so much that the intuitive is the only path
Yes.
forward. So for me, that question is like, how do we then now navigate from the intuitive as sort of like a reconnecting with that learned experience that happens often in childhood and then gets pushed out of us? I think that that might be a broader question that I could imagine 50 years from now.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Donnie. Muchas gracias for
Ah, de
being
nada.
here,
Un
for
gusto.
sharing your ideas with us, for being open to all kinds of questions and letting this evolve in a non-linear way. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, you too. And for your listeners for making it through this journey with us, I really appreciate it. It's been a lovely conversation. I've enjoyed it very much.